Good morning, Alex and friends. I'm Grace. Today is Wednesday, February 11th, 2026, and you're listening to Alex's News. The high in Riverside today is 59.5 degrees, with a low of 56.0, so expect a mild day with comfortable temperatures for getting out and about. Coming up, we'll examine the reasons behind the U.S. accusing China of conducting a covert nuclear test, and unpack why the Trump administration's EPA is pulling back the core legal framework supporting America's climate initiatives. Plus, we'll cover other key developments from around the world. All this and more on Alex's News. Stay tuned. We're starting this hour with a serious escalation in the nuclear debate between the United States and China. Ethan's been tracking it for us. Ethan, what exactly did Washington accuse Beijing of doing?
Earlier this month, on Thursday, February 6th, a senior U.S. arms control official stood up at the United Nations in Geneva and said China secretly conducted a nuclear explosion almost 6 years ago. According to coverage by Business Insider, republished by AOL and The Washington Post, Undersecretary Thomas Dinano claimed China set off an underground nuclear blast at its Lop Nur test site on June 22, 2020. He said U.S. intelligence assessed that it produced a yield in the hundreds of tons of TNT, which is much smaller than Cold War tests, but still a real nuclear explosion, not a zero-yield experiment. And he framed that as a violation of the global norm against any nuclear detonations.
So this wasn't just a vague warning, it was a very specific charge. What did Dinano say made this test so hard to detect?
He told the UN conference that China used what's called decoupling, which is an old arms control worry. According to Al Jazeera's write-up, he claimed the device was detonated inside a large underground cavity so the rock could flex and absorb much of the shock, dramatically shrinking the seismic signal that monitoring systems listen for. He also accused the Chinese military of preparing other tests at similar, hundreds of tons, yields and of blocking or scrambling data from some of their monitoring stations. The picture he painted was of a deliberate, concealed testing program just below the radar of the global system.
And this all centers on Lop Nur in Xinjiang, right? What do people need to know about that place?
Lop Nur is China's main historical nuclear testing ground, out in the northwest desert, and it's been in use since the 1960s. China's last acknowledged full nuclear test there was in 1996, before they declared a moratorium. Since then, like the United States and Russia, they say they've stuck to computer simulations and so-called subcritical experiments that don't produce a nuclear chain reaction. But as the Washington Post has detailed, commercial satellite images over the last several years show new tunnels, boreholes, roads, and power upgrades there, all pointing to a site being kept in high readiness.
Let's talk about China's reaction, because they fired back pretty fast. How are they answering this allegation?
Chinese officials have absolutely rejected it. According to the South China Morning Post and Al Jazeera, Beijing says it has not conducted any nuclear explosive tests since 1996 and is still honoring a unilateral testing moratorium. Their diplomats say what's happening at Lop Nur is simulations and non-yield work, the same kind of activity Washington does at the Nevada National Security Site. And they frame their broader nuclear posture as defensive, reminding people of their long-standing no first-use pledge, and saying their strategy is focused on deterrence, not expansionism.
But they've gone beyond just denying the test itself. How are they characterizing Washington's motives here?
Very bluntly, Chinese representatives, including Ambassador Shen Jian and Foreign Ministry spokesperson Liu Pengyu, have called the accusations, quote, outright lies and political manipulation, end quote. Business Insider reports they argue the United States is hyping a so-called China threat, both to justify building up its own arsenal and to prepare the ground for resuming U.S. nuclear testing in Nevada. They also say Washington is trying to drag them into three-way arms talks with Russia before the United States and Russia, who still have far more warheads, make deeper cuts of their own.
There's also this international body that's supposed to police nuclear tests, the CTBTO. What does it say about this alleged June 2020 blast?
The Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organization runs the global monitoring network, and its chief, Robert Floyd, has really pushed back on the specifics. In statements reported by PBS and RNZ, he said their international monitoring system did not detect any event with the characteristics of a nuclear weapon test at Lop Nur on June 22, 2020. That conclusion comes from a mix of seismic infrasound, hydroacoustic, and radionuclide stations spread around the world. After the U.S. revealed the exact date earlier this month, the CTBTO went back, re-reviewed the data, and says its analysts still see nothing that looks like a nuclear explosion that day.
The U.S. also suggested China was tampering with data from its monitoring stations. Did the CTBTO back that part up?
Not really. It's true, and the State Department has complained about this in the past, that for years, some Chinese stations weren't fully certified or sending continuous data. But the CTBTO's own technical updates, cited by RNZ, show that after about 2019, those Chinese stations came online in a much more reliable way, and now usually meet the organization's target of roughly 98% data availability, similar to stations in the United States or Europe. Importantly, for the date in question, June 22, 2020, the CTBTO says there were no suspicious outages or gaps in Chinese station data, and regional stations in Central Asia were working normally too.
If their network didn't see anything, does that mean the U.S. accusation has to be wrong? Or is there some wiggle room?
There is some scientific gray area, the CTBTO notes, and scientists quoted by outlets like Texas Public Radio agree, that their seismic system is very good at spotting normal underground explosions down to a fraction of a kiloton, but decoupling changes the picture. A well-decoupled blast in the hundreds of tons range might produce seismic signals near or below the network's practical detection threshold, especially in a noisy region. So the organization is essentially saying, we did not detect a test, and there is no evidence in our data that it happened, but we cannot mathematically prove that a perfectly hidden, heavily muffled explosion could not have occurred.
Outside the classified world, people have also pored over open data. What do independent scientists and satellite analysts see around that date?
Seismologists have checked public catalogs from places like the U.S. Geological Survey and the International Seismological Center, and there's no recorded quake or explosion near Lop Nur on that June 2020 date. That matches what the CTBTO is saying. On the imagery side, commercial firms like Planet Labs, along with analysts quoted in the Washington Post, have documented big investments at Lop Nur since about 2019, including a likely sixth tunnel complex and new vertical shafts. But those photos show construction and readiness, not a clear, smoking gun, like a crater or surface collapse on that specific day.
What about radioactive traces in the air, which we often hear about after nuclear tests? Did anybody pick up anything that points back to China?
The radionuclide story is telling. The CTBTO's network and national labs in Europe did not see any plume or noble gas pattern that could be traced back to Lop Nur in late June 2020. There were some mild detections of fission products in Northern Europe around that time, but according to assessments by European agencies cited by PBS, the likely source was a civilian facility in Western Russia or around the Baltic, not an underground Chinese test thousands of kilometers away. Experts stress, though, that a well-contained underground explosion is designed not to leak, so the absence of radioactive xenon or other markers doesn't by itself prove nothing happened.
We've mentioned this term, decoupling, a few times. For people just waking up with their coffee, how realistic is it that a country could truly hide a test that big?
Arms control physicists say it's technically possible but not trivial. In the right kind of hard rock, if you excavate a large enough cavity, you can let the blast expand more gently and cut the seismic punch by a factor of tens, as the National Academy of Sciences summarized in a study a little over a decade ago. That means a few hundred tons of yield could show up like a tiny local earthquake or not stand out at all in regional noise. At the same time, experts like Jeffrey Lewis and Hans Christensen, quoted in policy coverage, point out that the surface signs of such a decoupled test can look a lot like entirely legal subcritical experiments, which also involve tunnels, explosives, and instrumentation.
Okay, let's step back from the forensics for a moment. How does this fight fit into the bigger arms control picture, especially with New START just expiring last week?
The timing is crucial. New START, the last major U.S.-Russia treaty limiting deployed strategic warheads and launchers, formally expired on February 5th, just a few days ago. The Washington Post and PBS both note that means, for the first time in decades, the two biggest nuclear powers now have no binding, verifiable caps on their long-range arsenals. Against that backdrop, U.S. officials argue you can't keep doing bilateral deals that ignore China when the Pentagon projects Beijing's stockpile could exceed 1,000 warheads by around 2030, and China now has a full triad of land, sea, and air-based nuclear forces.
And yet, China has been pretty resistant to joining those talks. How are they justifying staying out of formal three-way negotiations?
Beijing's line is that its arsenal is still far smaller than those of Washington and Moscow, so the primary responsibility, in their phrase, lies with the two big Cold War powers to cut deeper first. They tell reporters from outlets like Eurasian Times and the South China Morning Post that they're willing to talk about arms control, but not in a framework that locks in an unequal status quo. They also argue that accusations like this Lopner claim only make them less willing to trust U.S. motives. From their perspective, Washington is using unverifiable intelligence to box them into constraints they never agreed to.
This also seems tied to politics here at home, especially under President Trump's return to office. How does the domestic U.S. debate play into this?
There's definitely a connection. In late 2025, just a few months ago, President Trump publicly ordered preparations to resume U.S. nuclear explosive testing, something the United States has not done since 1992. As Business Insider and Al Jazeera have reported, he argues that if Russia and China are supposedly conducting or preparing low-yield tests, America cannot be the only great power voluntarily sitting on its hands. The fresh allegation about a June 2020 Chinese test gives political cover to that argument, suggesting the U.S. is just leveling the playing field rather than walking away from a shared norm.
And what about the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty itself? We talk about it a lot, but has it ever actually gone into force?
The CTBT was adopted back in 1996 to ban all nuclear explosions, full stop, military or civilian. Almost 180 countries have ratified it, but because key players including the United States and China have signed but not ratified, it has never formally entered into force. Despite that legal limbo, both countries have honored moratoria on explosive testing for decades, relying on advanced simulations and non-yield experiments. The U.S. position now is that if China is secretly breaking the spirit of a zero-yield norm, then Washington is no longer morally bound to uphold it alone.
As of today, February 11th, where does that leave us in terms of what we actually know versus what's still in the shadows?
Pulling it all together, there are a few solid points and a big unresolved gap. We know China has heavily modernized Lopner since about 2019, with new tunnels and infrastructure that experts across the spectrum describe as clear test readiness. We know that back in June 2020, neither the CTBTO's instruments nor independent seismic and radionuclide networks picked up anything that clearly looks like a nuclear blast at that site. And we know New START is gone, China's arsenal is growing, and political pressure in Washington to resume U.S. testing is rising.
And the unresolved part? What are experts still arguing about behind the scenes?
The core unanswered question is whether, in that gray space between perfect detection and perfect concealment, China actually conducted a small, deeply buried decoupled test almost 6 years ago. The only direct assertion that it did comes from classified U.S. intelligence, as described by Thomas DeNano. No detailed public evidence has been released that outside analysts can independently verify. Technical specialists stress that the absence of a signal in open data is not proof that absolutely nothing happened, but they also emphasize that, as of this morning, there is zero independent, smoking gun to back the U.S. claim. That gap is what makes this dispute so corrosive. It erodes trust in both intelligence judgments and international monitoring, and it lands at exactly the moment when the world is drifting away from firm nuclear rules and toward a more dangerous, three-way arms competition.
A complicated and unsettling story, and it sounds like we're going to be living with the uncertainty for a while. Ethan, thanks for walking us through it. We are following a huge climate story out of Washington this week. The Trump administration is trying to pull out what some experts call the legal backbone of federal climate policy. Reporter Chloe Adams is with us. Chloe, what exactly did the Environmental Protection Agency do?
The EPA just finalized a rule yesterday that rescinds its 2009 endangerment finding for greenhouse gases. That is the formal determination that pollutants like carbon dioxide and methane endanger public health and welfare, and it is what legally forces EPA to regulate them. According to PBS NewsHour, which is drawing on Associated Press reporting, the agency is now saying it never really had clear authority under the Clean Air Act to regulate climate pollution in the first place. That is why many outlets, from the Washington Post to The Guardian, are calling this the single biggest rollback of United States climate policy so far.
For people who do not live in regulatory land, what is this endangerment finding, and why has it mattered so much?
It goes back to a Supreme Court case in 2007 called Massachusetts versus EPA. The court said greenhouse gases count as air pollutants under the Clean Air Act and ordered EPA to decide, based on science, whether vehicle emissions endanger health or welfare. After several years of review, the Obama-era EPA concluded in December 2009 that 6 greenhouse gases, including carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide, do exactly that. As the conversation explains, that finding became the legal hook for almost every major federal climate rule since then, from tailpipe standards for cars and trucks to carbon limits on power plants.
And courts had already weighed in on that, right? How settled was this before now?
It was very settled. The D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals upheld the endangerment finding and its related vehicle rules back in 2012, and every subsequent challenge lost, including one as recently as 2023. PBS NewsHour notes that no federal court has ever struck it down, and the scientific record supporting it has only grown stronger. That is part of why legal analysts see this new move as both aggressive and legally risky.
So what is in this new rule the EPA just finalized under President Trump?
According to the Wall Street Journal, reprinted by Greece's Tavima, the rule outright rescinds the 2009 finding and declares that EPA lacks statutory authority to regulate greenhouse gases based on global climate impacts. It immediately goes after vehicle standards, wiping out federal requirements for measuring and reporting greenhouse gas emissions from new cars and trucks, and dismantling the credit programs automakers use to comply. EPA Administrator Lee Zeldin has bragged that this is, in his words reported by the Journal, quote, the largest act of deregulation in the history of the United States, end quote. The White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt told PBS that it is about unleashing what she called American energy dominance and cutting costs.
You mentioned cars and trucks. What does this mean if somebody is shopping for a car in the next few years?
The rule targets standards from model year 2023 forward, so it is designed to undercut the Biden-era plan that would have pushed electric vehicles to more than half of new sales by 2032. The administration claims rolling back greenhouse gas rules will save about $1.3 trillion in regulatory costs and cut the sticker price of a new car by around $2,400. But independent analyses, including EPA's own regulatory impact work from 2024 and studies by Consumer Reports and the think tank Resources for the Future, say that is misleading. They find that you might pay a bit less upfront, but over the life of the vehicle, you spend thousands more on fuel and maintenance, leaving typical drivers $3,000 to $6,000 worse off.
So beyond vehicles, is this really aimed at blowing up climate regulation across the economy?
That is the goal. The endangerment finding is the legal linchpin not just for mobile sources like cars, but also for power plants and big industrial facilities. The Wall Street Journal reporting notes that once EPA says greenhouse gases are not officially endangering, it will argue it has no obligation to control carbon from coal and gas plants under Section 111 of the Clean Air Act. Environmental lawyers quoted in the Washington Post say this is like pulling the Jenga block at the bottom of the tower. It is designed to knock down power plant carbon rules, methane rules for oil and gas, and even some cross-state smog protections.
The administration's argument seems to be, we never had clear authority to do this anyway. How are they justifying that legally?
Their strategy leans heavily on the Supreme Court's newer major questions doctrine and the 2024 Loper-Bright decision, which cut back on courts deferring to agencies. EPA is now saying climate regulation is a matter of such vast economic and political significance that Congress needed to be crystal clear if it wanted EPA to do it, and since the Clean Air Act does not use the words climate change, they claim the authority is missing. That is in open tension with Massachusetts versus EPA, which explicitly said greenhouse gases fit within the Act's definition of pollutants, and that EPA must regulate them if they endanger health or welfare. Some conservative scholars, according to Bloomberg Law, see this case as a deliberate vehicle to get the more conservative Supreme Court to narrow or even overturn that earlier ruling.
And what about the science? The Trump team is also saying the original science was flawed, right?
Yes, and that is where the Department of Energy's Climate Working Group comes in. Energy Secretary Chris Wright handpicked 5 well-known critics of mainstream climate science, including John Christie and Judith Curry, to write a 2025 report claiming climate sensitivity to carbon dioxide is lower and impacts are less severe than the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says. The Conversation, which dug into that report, notes it even suggested rising carbon dioxide might have net benefits. EPA Chief Lee Zeldin has leaned on that document to argue the 2009 finding overstated risks.
How does that square with the broader scientific community and what other reviews have found?
It really does not square at all. A group of more than 85 climate scientists produced a 434-page rebuttal last fall, saying the DOE report was misleading or just flat-out wrong on many points. And Rutgers University's coverage highlighted claims of cherry-picked data and misrepresented studies. Meanwhile, the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine did its own review of the endangerment finding in 2025 at Congress's request and concluded the original determination has, quote, stood the test of time, end quote. They said the evidence that human-caused greenhouse gas emissions are warming the planet and harming health is now, in their words, beyond scientific dispute, and that recent extreme heat, flooding, and sea level rise only strengthen the case.
There was also a recent court ruling about that DOE working group itself. What did the judge say?
About 2 weeks ago, on January 30th, a federal judge in Massachusetts ruled that the Climate Working Group violated the Federal Advisory Committee Act. As the Conversation and Environmental Defense Fund report, Judge William Young found the group functioned as an advisory committee but was formed secretly, lacked balanced membership, and never allowed for public oversight, all of which FACA requires. The result is that its report is now considered legally tainted as the product of an unlawful process. Yet EPA still relies on it as a central scientific justification for reversing the endangerment finding, which legal scholars say is a serious problem under the Administrative Procedure Act's requirement for a rational, well-documented record.
So how are states and environmental groups responding? Are lawsuits already flying?
They are. A coalition of Democratic attorneys general, including California, New York, and Massachusetts, have already filed or announced suits in the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, according to PBS NewsHour and The Guardian. Major environmental groups like the Natural Resources Defense Council, Environmental Defense Fund, Earth Justice, the Sierra Club, and the Union of Concerned Scientists are joining in. Their core argument is that rescinding the endangerment finding violates the Clean Air Act and Massachusetts versus EPA, and that EPA is acting arbitrarily by ignoring a mountain of mainstream science in favor of a single, now tainted report.
What happens next in the courts, and how quickly could this be halted or take full effect?
The first big question is whether the D.C. Circuit grants a stay to temporarily freeze the rule while the case proceeds. Bloomberg Law reports that many legal experts think a stay is likely because EPA's own earlier analyses show that pausing greenhouse gas standards could cause irreparable harm through extra pollution and premature deaths. On the merits, we are looking at a multi-year fight, probably into 2027 or 2028, and almost everyone expects the Supreme Court to get the last word. If there is a stay, current vehicle and power plant rules may limp along for now. If not, the administration has a window to keep dismantling them while the courts deliberate.
You mentioned cars earlier, but there is also a big state versus federal piece here, especially around California. How does this change that balance?
It could create a surprising twist. Traditionally, Section 209 of the Clean Air Act prevents states from setting their own tailpipe standards, unless California gets a special waiver and other so-called Section 177 states follow. Now, by claiming greenhouse gases are not pollutants, EPA is allowed to regulate under that part of the law. The Trump EPA may have accidentally weakened its own preemption power. California officials and legal scholars like UCLA's Ann Carlson are arguing that if greenhouse gases are truly outside that section, then the federal government loses the ability to block states from setting their own climate or electric vehicle rules under broader state climate statutes.
How are car makers reacting to all of this? Do they actually want this level of deregulation?
The auto industry is wary. The Alliance for Automotive Innovation, which represents major car companies, complained that the Biden standards were tough but did not ask for the endangerment finding to be destroyed, according to industry coverage summarized by Fast Company. Their chief executive, John Bodzella, has warned that if California and its allied states go one way and the federal government goes another, you get what he called regulatory chaos and a split national market. Automakers also have to think globally. Europe and China are ratcheting up standards and pushing electric vehicles, so companies plan for that even if United States rules swing back and forth.
And what about the broader economic picture? The administration says this is about saving money and boosting growth. Do independent experts agree?
Not really. EPA's own past regulatory analyses for Obama and Biden-era rules generally found that the benefits of cutting climate and air pollution, avoided deaths, fewer hospital visits, fuel savings, and reduced climate damage far outweighed industry compliance costs. A 2024 EPA analysis projected about $2.1 trillion in net benefits from the vehicle standards alone, with hundreds of billions in fuel savings and even more in health and climate benefits. Researchers at Resources for the Future point out that the Trump EPA is basically setting climate damage to near zero on paper, which makes the books look better for deregulation but does not reflect real-world costs.
This is also happening as the administration makes a broader push for fossil fuels. How does this climate move fit into that larger agenda?
It fits very neatly. The Wall Street Journal and other outlets report that around the same time as this EPA rule, President Trump signed an order directing the Defense Department to lock in long-term purchases of coal-fired electricity, and federal money is being steered to keep or reopen coal plants in several states. Trump is even slated to receive an Undisputed Champion of Coal award from a Washington coal industry group. Interior Secretary Doug Burgum and Energy Secretary Chris Wright have been arguing that more fossil fuel production will, in their words, promote human flourishing, supercharge heavy industry, and power energy-hungry technologies like artificial intelligence.
Stepping back, Chloe, what is really at stake here over the next few years?
At the most basic level, this is about whether the federal government keeps any clear legal obligation to address climate pollution under existing law. If the Trump EPA's move survives in court, it could sideline federal greenhouse gas regulation for years, leaving a patchwork of state rules and voluntary corporate efforts in its place. It also tests how far the current Supreme Court is willing to go in rolling back earlier environmental precedents and limiting what agencies can do without new instructions from Congress. And, as the Washington Post notes, the stakes are not only legal or political. EPA's own numbers suggest that weakening climate and air quality rules could mean thousands of extra premature deaths and tens of billions in added health costs in the coming decades.
A lot to watch in the courts and on the ground. Reporter Chloe Adams, thanks for walking us through it.
Thank you.
Here are some other headlines. In Washington, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu arrives at the White House today to meet President Donald Trump, hoping to turn a narrow Iran talk into a full-court press. While Trump told a business network on Tuesday that he believes Tehran wants to make a deal, Netanyahu is pushing for a comprehensive accord that does not just cap uranium, but clips the wings of Iran's ballistic missile program and curbs support for Hezbollah and Hamas. The sit-down follows what both sides called constructive indirect talks in Oman last Friday, and comes with a United States naval armada already parked in the region. With memories of the June 2025 12-day war still raw, this summit could decide whether the next move is back to diplomacy or back to detonations. On Capitol Hill, Attorney General Pam Bondi takes the stand before the House Judiciary Committee, marking 1 year in the hot seat and not on a beach. Lawmakers are digging into the Justice Department's rollout of the Epstein Files Transparency Act, with critics saying officials dumped millions of pages while still withholding roughly 200,000 key documents about charging decisions. Survivors and members of Congress say sloppy blackouts exposed some victim identities, even as powerful associates of Jeffrey Epstein stayed in the shadows. Representative Summer Lee is threatening civil contempt if Bondi does not fully honor a bipartisan subpoena for unredacted records. The hearing doubles as a referendum on the department's independence, touching on alleged political weaponization, the firing of career prosecutors, and recent fatal shootings by federal agents, along with FBI searches at local election facilities. It is files and tribulations for the nation's top law enforcement officer. Also on the Hill, acting Immigration and Customs Enforcement Chief Todd Lyons has been lionized by supporters and lion-tamed by critics over a controversial raid in Idaho. A new federal lawsuit, backed by the ACLU of Idaho, says state and federal agents turned La Cathedral Arena in Wilder from horse track to rights track, detaining about 400 people in an October 2025 operation, including United States citizens and children in zip ties. The warrant was for gambling and produced only 5 arrests on that front, but more than 100 people ended up in immigration custody. Plaintiffs call it a fishing expedition soaked in racial profiling. Lyons defended what he termed a mass deportation mandate and refused to apologize for masked agents and the detention of legal residents, drawing fire from Democrats. The case will test whether criminal warrants can be used as a backdoor for immigration dragnets, with big implications for mixed-status families, a multi-agency Treasure Valley task force, and an upcoming Department of Homeland Security funding showdown. Overseas, Bangladesh is bracing for ballots after its monsoon revolution. On February 11, 2026, voters head into the first national election since the youth-driven uprising of July 2024 ended Sheikh Hasina's 15-year rule. Interim Chief Advisor and Nobel laureate Muhammad Yunus is urging a historic turnout to break 17 years of silence, as more than 127 million eligible voters choose a new parliament and decide a referendum on the July Charter. The reform blueprint would cap prime ministerial terms and bolster judicial independence, a stress test for the country's democratic transition. For the first time, nearly 15 million expatriates can vote by mail, turning the Postal Service into a political lifeline. With the former ruling Awami League suspended, the race pits the Bangladesh Nationalist Party against a fresh alliance of student leaders and Islamist parties, including the new National Citizen Party. From microcredit to macro-democracy, Yunus now hopes to lend stability to a volatile region. In health news, the United States Food and Drug Administration has given Moderna's flu shot ambitions a cold shoulder. Regulators issued a refusal to file letter for the company's first messenger RNA seasonal flu vaccine, mRNA-1010, meaning they will not even start a full review. The agency's Biologics Center, led by Dr. Vinay Prasad, says the trial used the wrong yardstick, comparing the candidate to a standard dose flu shot, instead of what officials now call the best available standard of care. Moderna's chief executive Stefan Bancel calls the move inconsistent with written guidance that dates back to 2024. The snub lands under Health and Human Services Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr., whose team has tightened the screws on messenger RNA approvals. Moderna's stock slid by about 10% on fears that regulatory whiplash is plaguing the biotech sector. While the same vaccine file is under review in Europe, Canada, and Australia, the United States timeline has caught a regulatory flu, with Moderna urgently seeking a top-level meeting to keep its program from being delayed for years. That's all we have for now. Today's episode was made by Alexander King with GPT 5.1, Gemini Pro 3, Gemini Flash 3, and Google Cloud Text-to-Speech. I hope you have a great day. I'll see you tomorrow, Alex.